In September 1987, Hugh Wilson bought 109 hectares of land that farmers had failed to tame for 87 years, and he did what no one had dared to do. He let New Zealand's most hated plant take over the entire property. The neighbors decided he'd lost his mind. One even wrote to the local paper, "God protect us from fools and dreamers." But over the following 39 years, Hinawai grew from 109 to 1,700 hectares. 35 species of native birds returned. More than 350 plant species appeared, and where there had once been almost no trees, 47 permanent waterfalls now run. What did Wilson know about this plant that no one else did? To understand what happened next, you have to understand what New Zealand was like before people arrived. Before Polynesian settlers came, both islands were covered in continuous forest from the coast to the peaks. European colonists destroyed 98 to 99% of that forest. Pasture took its place, but on the steep slopes, a plant appeared that the colonists themselves had brought from Europe. Gorse, Ilex europaeus. Charles Darwin saw it in New Zealand gardens as early as 1835. By the end of the 19th century, it covered hundreds of thousands of hectares. In 1900, Parliament declared it a noxious weed, but a fundamental problem emerged. Gorse seed lies in the soil for up to 50 years and will not germinate as long as there is competition. When a farmer burns gorse or bulldozes it away, he warms the soil and clears the shade, and the seed wakes up. Gorse comes back twice as thick as before it was cleared. By the early 80s, New Zealanders were spending $22 million a year just controlling it, with no real result. The land the Maurice White Native Forest Trust bought in 1987 was a textbook case of this dead end. 109 hectares of former farmland, with 4 hectares of remnant beech forest in the deepest gullies, and gorse everywhere. The previous owner, Tom Bates, whom Wilson knew personally as a friend of his older brother Jim, had fought it for years with every method available. Gorse won. The land was considered hopeless for any kind of farming. But Wilson knew something about gorse that ecologists knew and farmers didn't. Wilson had spent years on Banks Peninsula before Hinawai existed, doing a botanical survey slope by slope, every plant recorded by hand. And he noticed something farmers saw every day but never read as a signal. Where gorse had stood long enough and where livestock couldn't reach, native seedlings were growing underneath it. Kanuka and young totara, unnoticed, protected by the thorns, alive. Gorse both hid and fed them at once. As a legume, it fixes nitrogen from the air and pumps it into depleted soil up to 200 kilograms per hectare per year, reviving land that decades of sheep farming had left dead. But the important part wasn't that, it was what happened next. This is what Wilson saw on the slopes during his survey and turned from an interesting fact into a working plan. Gorse needs direct sunlight, and shade kills it as reliably as herbicide, while native trees grow slowly but survive in shade. Once they outgrow the gorse and their canopies take the sunlight, it dies and composts itself, fertilizing the very soil it spent years enriching. The forest stands, the gorse disappears, and no human hand does any of it. Wilson later put it plainly, "This isn't my idea. It's an ecologically well-known fact. Gorse is a pioneer successional plant that under most conditions gives way to native forest. But knowing a fact and daring to build a 30-year plan on it are different things, and Wilson dared because he'd seen the evidence with his own eyes. One practical condition remained: remove the animals, because sheep, goats, deer, and possums destroy native seedlings before they can grow up under the gorse's protection. Remove them and do nothing else." It was with this plan that he showed up at a forest and bird meeting in 1986, where he met Maurice White, a Christchurch accountant who had been setting aside his own money since 1977 to buy land for native forest and was looking for someone who knew where and how. Wilson had just finished his survey and knew every slope on the peninsula. He pointed to 109 hectares of ruined farmland near Akaroa, and in September 1987, the trust bought the land and appointed him manager. The first thing Wilson did was write to the Akaroa Mail, explaining to the neighbors what would be happening next to their farms, that he would not touch the gorse, that he would remove the grazing animals, and that nothing else was planned. The next issue of the paper carried a letter from a neighboring farmer who wrote that he had nothing against nature and nothing against preserving what patches of forest still remained on the slopes, but that letting gorse grow unchecked and waiting for it to turn into native forest on its own was, in his view, not a plan or a method, but the business of fools and dreamers. The district read it and agreed. Wilson read it and kept doing nothing. The first year turned out harder than Wilson expected, not because of the land, which behaved exactly as he had predicted, but because of the people around it, who did not understand and had no intention of waiting. Wilson arrived at Hinawai in the autumn of 1987. No crew, no equipment, no salary for the first few years. He put up a fence to keep out the neighbors' stock, started trapping goats that roamed freely on the slopes, and set up a small base at the edge of the reserve. Nothing more. The land was meant to start on its own. His job was only to stay out of the way and clear away anything that got in its. The summer of 1988 brought no rain for so long that grass across the whole peninsula first yellowed, then burned down to the roots, and farmers watched their stock in the sky in turns, no clouds above, and their stock running out of feed below. One of Hinawai's neighbors realized that the herd he'd built up over years might not survive the summer. Wilson opened the gates and let someone else's starving cattle graze on his land, on the patches where grass still remained that the gorse hadn't yet taken over. For the reserve, it even made practical sense, but the farmer read it differently. A man the whole district considered a dangerous eccentric and expected to fail had opened his land during the worst possible crisis with no conditions and no calculations attached. From that day on, the neighboring farm became a friend for good, and that turned out to matter more than it seemed at the time. A few years later, that same neighbor hired a helicopter to spray a steep slope. Wilson wrote him a letter saying the helicopter had destroyed rare plants on a slope the farmer had thought was just gorse. The neighbor came to look. He saw orchids he'd never noticed on his own land. They agreed. 5 hectares of that slope would go to Hinawai for good. That same summer, on that same land, the gorse bloomed yellow. Nothing else was visible. 30 centimeters below, under the thorns, the first Kanuka seedlings were quietly growing. But while the gorse did its work up top, Wilson was doing his down below, and that work looked nothing like passive observation. Possums, marsupials brought over from Australia, destroy native seedlings just as effectively as sheep do. Wilson didn't initially realize how destructive they were, but he changed his mind and launched a control program. Metal traps along the tracks, night shooting, poison baits under licensed protocols. Wild goats turned out to be an even harder problem. They moved freely across steep slopes a person could barely reach. Wilson admitted he didn't believe he'd manage it. "I never thought we'd do it, but we did." By 1999, 12 years of continuous work, wild goats at Hinawai had been completely eliminated. The control program became a permanent part of the reserve's work. Traps along every track, needing regular checks since a sprung trap catches nothing. Night shooting with a torch. Poison baits under licensed protocols, only where there was no risk to native birds. A few years into the program, one 2-week operation caught 29 possums across the whole reserve, a sign of success, given there had once been hundreds. Stoats and rats arrived as a separate problem. The stoat, a small predator introduced to control rabbits, turned out to be an effective killer of native birds, climbing into nests and eating eggs and chicks. At Hinawai, without control, native birds couldn't have recovered even if the forest had already stood ready. Traps for stoats and rats were added to the regular route. Alongside this, work went on at the perimeter, stopping new incursions from neighboring farms. Sheep and cattle sometimes broke through the fence. Every such incursion meant destroyed seedlings in areas where the gorse hadn't yet grown enough to protect them. Wilson patched fences, negotiated with neighbors, returned other people's stock. This is the part of the project that almost never makes it into documentaries about Hinawai. They show the yellow and the green, before and after, but between them is more than just time and gorse. Between them are years of night patrols with a torch, poison boxes on hard-to-reach slopes, and a diary where every new animal on the property was recorded by hand that same evening. Wilson once put it simply, "The work is endless." Minimal intervention means intervening only where nature genuinely can't manage on its own. With the trees, it can. With 70 million possums, it can't. Local authorities added pressure of their own. Regulations required controlling gorse along property boundaries. Wilson had to clear the reserve's edges even while, inside, that same gorse was doing exactly the job it needed to do. In the Hinawai Bulletin, he would later sum up the main obstacles of 35 years in a single line: droughts, floods, landslides, frosts, earthquakes, misguided regional council rules, and fire. Fire came in 2011. Lightning burned roughly a third of the reserve. Years of growth burned in a matter of days. But the fire opened up the soil and cleared the shade. Gorse began growing again on the burned ground, and once again protected the native seedlings. By 2017, vegetation on the burned sections had recovered. Wilson had predicted the first real breakthrough as early as 1990 in an article for the Canterbury Botanical Society Journal. He wrote that in moist gullies with good seed access, native trees should overtake the gorse in about 10 years. On drier ridges, 30 or more. In the latter half of the 90s, the tops of Kianuka began appearing above the yellow carpet. Not everywhere, in scattered pockets where conditions were best. But where the trees broke through, the gorse disappeared for good. Wilson later wrote, "I said it would happen in about 10 years in the wet gullies, and that's exactly what happened." Then came December 2021. On December 15th, Hinawai received a record amount of rainfall in a single day. Massive landslides tore through the reserve. One was 90 meters wide, formed from 3 smaller ones that had merged into one. Tracks were destroyed. The forest Wilson had spent decades restoring looked torn apart. He documented every landslide by hand and wrote, in an article, what 35 years of observation had taught him. You start to give up the illusion of a smooth march toward a mature, stable forest, and think instead that vegetation is simply reacting, constantly. 6 months later, the first plants were already growing on the bare landslide ground. Among them, young gorse. The same plant that 35 years earlier had started it all was now patching up the wounds left by disaster. Wilson recorded it in the bulletin and kept the diary going, as he had every day since 1987. To understand what exactly he documented over these 39 years, the numbers say it plainly. 109 hectares in 1987. 1,700 hectares as of 2026, including neighboring plots the reserve manages as part of a network of protected areas. 350 plant species, 35 species of native birds, including the tomtit, which children on neighboring farms never used to see near their homes and now hear every morning. Riflemen, tiny forest birds, falcons, rare green geckos in the scrub. 47 waterfalls that flow year-round. That figure is a direct result of the restored forest. Roots hold the slopes, branches slow the rain, and dead leaf litter absorbs water and releases it into the streams slowly, over months. Where the ground used to dry out immediately after rain, water now flows constantly. Around 100,000 New Zealand dollars a year comes in from carbon credits through the emissions trading scheme, and that income funds the purchase of new land. 1 hectare of restored forest absorbs roughly 10 tons of carbon dioxide a year. Wilson sells these credits only to companies that have made a public zero emissions commitment. We ethically vet every business we sell credits to. Not a single tree planted in 39 years. The neighboring farmers, the same ones whose parents responded to Wilson's first notice with a letter to the paper, now fence off the steep gullies on their own land and leave them alone. Let the gorse grow. Let the forest come back. They no longer pay for spraying, and they earn carbon credits from slopes where nothing used to grow. Hinawai has stopped being an island. The reserve is now connected to adjoining protected areas across the whole crater rim, together forming New Zealand's first fully protected catchment from summit to sea. Little blue penguins and fur seals have appeared along the shoreline, species not seen here in decades. Wilson gave up his 90-kilometer bike rides long ago. He lives at Hinawai in a solar-powered hut with no internet, no phone. But if anyone asks about an e-bike, he answers through a gray beard. "I'm not old enough for an e-bike yet." He's 81. He still works more than a 40-hour week, and every day he writes his observations into a field journal by hand. But here is what remains unresolved. Hinawai rests on an 81-year-old man. Wilson has trained 3 younger assistants, Paul Newport, Ash, and Max. But the method is not built on knowledge alone. Twice a year, there is an illustrated bulletin, the PPP, drawn and written by his own hand. 39 years of this conversation with the landscape. Whether it can be passed on is a question with no answer yet. There is scientific doubt, too. Ecologist Ian Popey notes that a forest that grows up through gorse differs from a forest that would have grown without it. Gorse changes soil chemistry. What consequences that will have in 50 or 100 years is unknown. The Hawke's Bay Regional Council states officially that it cannot recommend the Hinawai method as a standard, and there is a new threat. Wild deer, escapees from neighboring farms, are starting to get into the reserve. Wilson called them the next big nightmare. The goats took 12 years to eliminate, but deer are faster and more cautious. Hinawai's team has begun the work. How long this round will take is still unknown. Hugh Wilson talks about the future today just as calmly as he talked about gorse in 1987. He wants to expand the reserve by a few specific parcels because those patches of land are ecologically necessary for the system's integrity. There are 3 parcels that could connect Hinawai to other protected areas. He has not let go of that idea, but there is a question he does not ask out loud himself, one that hangs over the whole project. The minimal intervention method requires a different way of seeing land, as a process you should not interfere with. Wilson learned this over decades of fieldwork. Teaching it to 3 young assistants is a task that is not solved yet. Meanwhile, neighboring farmers in the valley are fencing off their steep gullies. 500 hectares of the neighboring Te Ahu Patiki project above Littleton Harbor are applying the same logic. New Zealand's Department of Conservation has published a practical guide to the gorse method for landowners. The Hawke's Bay Regional Council officially objects to it, but the guide has been published and is spreading. The method is moving beyond one man and one reserve, slowly, but it's moving. There's one more thing worth knowing. A few months ago, local radio reported that Hugh Wilson had died. Who said it and why is unclear. Friends called each other asking if it was true. Wilson found out about his own death and wrote it into the Paipipi Bulletin. "People kept asking my friends, 'Has Hugh gone?' he wrote. Then added, 'It was funny.'" He still keeps his diary by hand. Every plant, bird, landslide, drought, every change in the gully he knows by heart. The 1988 photo shows yellow. Solid, unbeatable, hated yellow from edge to edge. The 2016 photo from the same spot shows green forest. No one planted anything. Wilson once said, "Even rare plants are mostly just waiting for the chance to break through again." They waited 87 years underground. Gorse gave them 10 more, and that was enough.